A man who could tear a lion apart with his bare hands stood alone in the dust of a shattered battlefield, his chest rising and falling as silence swallowed the echoes of war. And in his grip, the crude jawbone of a donkey dripped with the proof that no army, no weapon, no force of men could stand against him. They would call him unstoppable, a living legend whispered in fear by his enemies and in awe by his people. A man chosen by God before he ever drew breath, set apart to deliver a nation from oppression and carry a strength that felt less like flesh and more like something divine. Yet beneath the weight of that power, there was a quieter struggle, one no crowd could see, as the same man knelt beside still water, staring into a reflection that did not look like a conqueror but a soul divided, restless and searching for something he could not name. Because the truth was far more dangerous than any enemy. His battles were never only against the Philistines, but against the desires that pulled at him from within, the pride that whispered he needed no one, not even the God who had given him everything. And in the shadows of his strength, a different story was already beginning to unfold. One of betrayal, of broken vows, of love that would cost him everything. For what happens when a man chosen by God becomes careless with the very gift that set him apart? And what if the greatest enemy he would ever face was himself? Long before his name would be spoken in fear, the land itself groaned under the weight of oppression, as the Philistines ruled with iron certainty and Israel lived in quiet despair. Their villages shadowed by foreign power and their prayers rising into a silence that felt unanswered. In the midst of that darkness, a promise was given to a woman who had never known the joy of a child. As a messenger of God declared that her son would be set apart from birth, consecrated as a Nazirite, marked not by crown or sword, but by obedience, his life bound to a sacred covenant that would make him an instrument of deliverance. He grew as a child unlike any other, carrying within him a strength that revealed itself in flashes, lifting what others could not, overpowering those far older, as though something beyond human flesh stirred beneath his skin, something holy yet untamed. But alongside that strength, there was a restlessness that refused to be guided, a stubborn will that bent toward desire rather than wisdom. And it surfaced most clearly when he set his eyes on a Philistine woman and demanded her as his own, ignoring the warnings of his parents and the boundaries of his calling. The signs were already there, subtle but undeniable, as he began to treat what was sacred as ordinary, touching what was unclean and crossing lines meant to protect him, while the world saw only a rising hero, unaware that the very foundation of his strength was quietly beginning to crack. On the road to Timnah, as dry winds stirred the dust beneath his feet and the quiet stretched between distant hills, the moment came without warning, when a lion burst from the brush with a roar that shattered the stillness and lunged with lethal force toward the man who had been set apart for something greater. For an instant, everything hung in balance between fear and instinct. But instead of retreat, Samson surged forward with a strength that felt almost otherworldly, gripping the beast with his bare hands and tearing it apart as though flesh and bone were nothing more than fragile threads beneath his power. It was a miracle, undeniable and raw, a sign that the Spirit of God moved through him. Yet instead of awe or reverence, he walked away as if such power required no explanation, no gratitude, no pause. Days later, when he passed the same path again, he found something unexpected, as bees had made honey within the hollow of the lion's carcass, and without hesitation he reached in, eating from what was once dead and defiled, sharing it with others while hiding its source. In that quiet moment, unseen by any crowd, the shift began, as sacred boundaries were crossed not in defiance but in indifference, and what had been given as a holy calling slowly became something he treated as his own. Soon after, what began as desire led him into conflict, And as betrayal unfolded at his wedding feast, the first sparks of violence ignited, turning personal choices into consequences that would no longer remain contained. What began as a personal conflict soon erupted into something far more destructive, as the Philistines answered Samson's violence with cruelty of their own. Burning his wife and her father alive in a brutal act meant not only to punish, but to provoke, turning grief into a fire that consumed whatever restraint he had left. His response was swift and merciless, striking them down in retaliation with a fury that no longer distinguished between justice and vengeance, as each act of violence fed the next, and the line between deliverer and destroyer blurred beneath the weight of his unchecked power. The land itself seemed to catch fire with his anger as he released foxes into the Philistine fields with torches bound to their tails, sending flames racing through grain, vineyards, and olive groves, leaving devastation in his wake and forcing an entire nation to feel the consequences of one man's war. But the escalation did not stop there as the Philistines gathered in force, their armies no longer seeking revenge alone, but determined to eliminate the threat he had become. And in their fear, even the people of Israel turned against him, binding him with ropes and handing him over in desperate hope of peace. Yet when those ropes tightened around him, they snapped like threads under sudden strain. And with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey in his hand, he struck down 1,000 men, a single figure standing against an army and winning with terrifying ease. In that moment, the legend of Samson reached its peak, but so did the danger within him as victory began to whisper a lie he was too willing to believe, that the strength was his and that he needed no one to sustain it. And then, where strength had failed to humble him, something far quieter began to succeed, as love, or what felt like love, entered his life not with force but with softness, in the form of a woman whose presence disarmed him in ways no army ever could. Delilah did not come with threats or weapons, but with patience and curiosity, her voice gentle, her questions persistent, as the rulers of the Philistines watched from a distance and placed their silver in her hands, asking only that she uncover the secret that made him unstoppable. At first, Samson treated it like a game, offering false answers with a smile, letting her bind him with bowstrings, then ropes, then weaving his hair, each time breaking free with ease as if betrayal itself had no weight, as if danger could be laughed away. But beneath the repetition, something deeper was unraveling, because every time he stayed, every time he ignored the warning signs, he stepped closer to a line he would not be able to cross back from. Delilah's persistence did not weaken, and neither did his desire to remain. Until at last, worn down not by force but by emotion, Samson spoke the truth he had guarded all his life, confessing that his strength was bound to the covenant he had carried since birth. In that moment, the choice was no longer hidden or accidental, as he surrendered the very source of his calling into hands he knew he could not trust. And though nothing had yet been taken from him, everything had already been set in motion. Sleep came not as rest, but as surrender, as Samson laid his head in Delilah's lap, unaware that the trust he offered so freely would become the instrument of his undoing, while unseen hands moved in the shadows and a blade drew near to sever what had never been meant to be touched. With each quiet stroke, his hair fell away, the visible mark of a covenant now broken. And though nothing in the moment seemed to shift, the unseen presence that had once surged through him began to withdraw, leaving behind a strength that was no longer sustained by anything greater than himself. When he awoke to the sound he had heard so many times before, the cry that the Philistines were upon him, he rose with the same confidence, expecting the familiar rush of power to answer his call, but for the first time his body did not respond, and the strength he had always relied on was simply gone. Where ropes had once snapped like fragile threads, they now held firm against his struggle, and where enemies had once fallen before him in waves, They now closed in without resistance, capturing him not as a warrior, but as a man stripped of everything that had defined him. The reversal was complete and merciless as they gouged out his eyes, turning the one who had once seen danger from afar into a man surrounded by darkness, and led him away in chains to grind grain like an animal, his former glory reduced to a spectacle of defeat. Yet even in that darkness, something small and almost unnoticed began again. As his hair slowly grew back, strand by strand, carrying with it the faintest whisper that what had been lost might not be gone forever. The day of celebration rose loud and triumphant for the Philistines as crowds gathered within the towering temple, their voices echoing through stone halls while they praised their God for delivering the man who had once terrified them, now reduced to a blind prisoner led by the hand and mocked for sport. They called him forward not as a warrior, but as a spectacle, laughing as he stumbled, jeering as if his fall proved that his strength had never been divine at all. While the same hands that once shattered armies now reached out only to feel the unfamiliar weight of space and silence. But within that broken frame, something had changed, because the pride that once filled him had been stripped away, leaving behind a clarity forged through loss, and for the first time in a long while, his voice turned not outward in defiance, but inward in surrender. He prayed quietly, not for vengeance, not for the restoration of what he had been, but simply for God to remember him, to grant him strength one final time, not for himself, but for a purpose greater than his own desires. Guided to the central pillars of the temple, he placed his hands against the cold stone, feeling the structure that held everything above him, and as the noise of the crowd swelled around him, he drew in a breath that carried the weight of every choice he had made. Then, with trembling arms that slowly found renewed strength, he pushed, and what began as a strain became a fracture, and what fractured became collapse, as the pillars gave way, and the entire temple came crashing down in a thunderous end that buried both his enemies and himself beneath the same falling weight. When the roar of collapsing stone faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, dust settled over what had once been a place of triumph, now reduced to ruin, as the weight of shattered pillars and broken walls lay across both the oppressors and the one who had brought them down. Beneath the debris, the man who had once stood unchallenged on battlefields now lay still, his final act not one of pride but of surrender, as the strength he had misused for so long found its true purpose only in the moment it cost him everything. Word spread slowly across Israel, not as a tale of victory shouted in celebration, but as a story carried with reverence and sorrow, as those who had feared for their lives now recognized the price that had been paid to break the power of their enemies. His family came to gather what remained, carrying him away from the ruins of the temple to the place of his beginnings, where the promise spoken before his birth lingered like an echo, fulfilled in a way no one had expected. And in the quiet that followed, his life stood as something more than a rise and fall. Because though he had stumbled under the weight of his own choices, his ending revealed a truth that endured beyond failure. That even a broken man could still complete the purpose he had been given. Generations would remember his name not only as a warrior of impossible strength, but as a man whose life carried a warning written just as deeply as his victories, because his story refused to settle into something simple, instead standing as both triumph and tragedy woven together in one unforgettable life. He became a mirror held up to every heart that has ever carried a gift, a calling, or a measure of influence, asking quietly but relentlessly what happens when strength is no longer guided, when desire speaks louder than wisdom, and when the very things meant to set a person apart begin to be treated as if they were ordinary. For some, his fall would stand as a caution against pride, a reminder that power without discipline does not remain power for long, but turns inward and begins to unravel the one who holds it, while for others, his final act would speak of something deeper, that even after failure, even after consequences have taken their toll, purpose is not beyond reach. And in a world far removed from ancient battlefields, the question still lingers in quieter forms, in choices made behind closed doors, in compromises that seem small but carry unseen weight. As every life holds its own version of strength and its own potential for downfall. Because the truth remains unchanged, that what defines a person is not only how they rise, but whether they are willing to return, even in brokenness, to the source of what gave them strength in the first place.